The project I chose to develop is a weight/health monitor. The goal I had years ago was to build a website that helps me and my friends stay on top of workouts and our health items such as caloric intake or daily weight goals. On the homepage here, I experimented with Bootstrap and created a carousel that shows some of the features of the application. I can register a new account or log in from any page as I created each page using Jinja templates. My data model has a one-to-many relationship that allows me to store many pieces of information for each user. When I log in here, I save the current user in a session cookie. I then use Flask and SQL Alchemy to query the database for the user that is contained in the session cookie. If the login is successful, I make a series of AJAX calls to query the database and make 3 API calls. We can see my last 5 recorded weights and comments for those days here. This graph on the right allows me to track caloric intake. The API call behind this returns a JSON object with how many calories are needed for me. I then query my database for how many calories I have eaten and subtract these from the total. With this information, I use JavaScript and Chart.js to update the HTML and display a pie chart with the new information. The water intake graph works similarly, but I have implemented it without comments in the database table for water intake. Lastly, I query my database for weight, height, and activity level and use an API to calculate body mass index. Before I implemented these asynchronous calls, my page loading times were taking longer than desired. I was making multiple queries to my database and then using that data to make API calls and then do more calculations before rendering the page. I realized I would need to separate API calls and calculations on the back end. I refactored a large portion of my application to do this. I created new routes for each API call and minimized the calculations that were happening. I also reduced the number of queries to my database. Now, once I have finished loading the data for each chart or component, I can update the DOM and render the new information asynchronously on the web page. Now that I have implemented those items on the page, the responsiveness feels a lot better.